What would you do if you walked into a random cafe for coffee and came face to face with someone you hadn't seen in 30 years? Someone who was once the most important person in your life, someone you thought about almost every day but never knew how to find. And what if the life they were living was completely different from what you imagined? So different that seeing them behind that counter made your heart break and your entire perspective shift in an instant. That's exactly what happened when tech billionaire Marcus Webb walked into a small cafe in Portland, Oregon, and locked eyes with the man who had once been his best friend, his brother in every way that mattered, and the person who had saved his life more times than he could count. What Marcus did next didn't just change one man's life. It reminded millions of people what loyalty, gratitude, and true friendship actually look like. This is a story about two boys who grew up with nothing, the different paths their lives took, and a reunion that proves some bonds can never be broken no matter how much time passes or how far apart life pulls you. Marcus Webb and Daniel Carter met on the first day of third grade in a rough neighborhood in Detroit in 1987. Marcus was the new kid, small for his age, wearing clothes that were too big because they were hand-me-downs from a cousin. Daniel was the kid everyone knew, not because he was popular, but because he was kind, the type of 8-year-old who would share his lunch without being asked and stand up to bullies even when it meant getting hurt himself. They became inseparable within a week. They walked to school together, did homework at each other's houses, spent weekends exploring abandoned buildings and imagining futures that looked nothing like the poverty surrounding them. Marcus was brilliant with numbers and ideas, always sketching inventions in notebooks and talking about the businesses he'd start someday. Daniel was the dreamer, the one who believed in those ideas when no one else did, the one who told Marcus he was going to change the world. They made a pact when they were 12, sitting on the roof of Daniel's apartment building watching the Detroit skyline. They promised that no matter what happened, no matter where life took them, they'd always be brothers. They'd always have each other's backs. And for years, they kept that promise. High school was where their paths started to diverge, though neither of them saw it coming. Marcus earned a full scholarship to MIT based on a computer program he'd written that caught the attention of a teacher who submitted it to a national competition. He was leaving Detroit, leaving everything he knew, including Daniel. The night before Marcus left for college, they sat on that same rooftop, and Daniel said something Marcus never forgot. He said, "You're going to do incredible things. You're going to make it out of here, and you're going to prove that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. And when you make it big, don't forget about the rest of us down here. Promise me you won't forget." Marcus promised. He meant it with everything in him. But life has a way of making promises complicated. Marcus thrived at MIT. He launched his first startup at 22, sold it at 25 for $18 million, and used that money to build what would become one of the most successful tech companies of the 2000s. By the time he was 40, his net worth was estimated at over $2 billion. He had homes in 3 countries, a private jet, access to every luxury imaginable. He appeared on magazine covers and gave TED Talks and was celebrated as a self-made success story, the kid from Detroit who had beaten the odds. But there was a gap in that story, a piece he rarely talked about. During those early years of building his career, Marcus had lost touch with almost everyone from his old life. It wasn't intentional at first. He was working 100 hours a week. He moved to Silicon Valley. His phone number changed. His focus narrowed to survival and then to success. And somewhere in that chaos, he lost contact with Daniel. He thought about him often, wondered how he was doing, told himself he'd reach out soon. But soon turned into months and months, turned into years and years, turned into a silence so long that breaking it felt impossible. Daniel's life had gone a different direction. He had stayed in Detroit, gotten a job at an auto plant right out of high school to help support his mom who was sick. He worked there for 15 years until the plant closed during the 2008 recession. He struggled to find steady work after that. He went through a divorce. He lost his apartment. For a while, he was homeless, sleeping in shelters and on friends' couches, trying to piece together enough hours at temp jobs to survive. He eventually saved enough to move to Portland where his sister lived, hoping for a fresh start. He got a job at a small independent cafe called Brewed Awakening, making barely above minimum wage. But it was stable and the owner was kind, and it was enough to rent a tiny studio apartment and start rebuilding some kind of life. He was 53 years old, working a cash register and making lattes, and most days he was okay with it. He'd accepted that his life wasn't going to look like what he'd imagined as a kid. But sometimes, late at night, he'd think about Marcus. He'd wonder if his childhood best friend had made it, if those big dreams had come true. He'd Google him occasionally and see the articles and photos of this wildly successful billionaire and feel this complicated mix of pride and sadness and distance. That was his brother. They'd shared everything once. And now they lived in completely different worlds. That on a rainy Tuesday morning in March 2019, Marcus was in Portland for a series of investor meetings. His schedule was packed, back-to-back appointments. But he had a 30-minute gap between meetings, and his assistant suggested a cafe nearby where he could grab coffee and make some calls. Marcus walked into Brood Awakening, his head down, looking at his phone, already mentally rehearsing his next pitch. The cafe was small and cozy, local art on the walls, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods, indie music playing softly. There were only a few customers. Marcus approached the counter, still looking at his phone, and said, "Can I get a large black coffee to go?" And then he looked up, and he froze. Because standing behind that counter, wearing a brown apron with the cafe's logo, a little grayer and a lot more tired than the last time he'd seen him, but unmistakably, undeniably him, was Daniel. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at each other, the recognition washing over them in waves. Daniel's eyes went wide. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Marcus felt like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. And then Daniel said, so quietly it was almost a whisper, "Marcus? Is that really you?" Marcus nodded, his throat tight, and said, "Danny." "Oh my God, Danny." And just like that, 30 years collapsed into nothing. Daniel came around the counter, and the two men hugged, right there in the middle of the cafe, both of them holding on like they were afraid the other would disappear. The other customers watched, confused but moved by whatever was clearly happening. When they finally pulled apart, both of them had tears in their eyes. They talked for 3 hours. Marcus canceled his meetings. Daniel's boss, seeing what was happening, told him to take the rest of the day off. They sat at a corner table and filled in 3 decades of blank space. Marcus talked about his success, but also about the loneliness of it, the guilt he'd carried for losing touch, the way he'd thought about Daniel constantly, but convinced himself too much time had passed to reconnect. Daniel talked about the factory closing, the hard years, the divorce, being homeless, the slow climb back to stability. He didn't say it with bitterness, just with the weary honesty of someone who had lived through things and survived. Marcus listened and felt his heart breaking because this man, his best friend, the person who had believed in him when no one else did, had been struggling while Marcus built an empire. And Marcus had done nothing. He hadn't reached out. He hadn't checked in. He'd let life and success and distance become excuses. When Daniel finished talking, Marcus said something that would change everything. He said, "You told me once not to forget where I came from." "I didn't forget, Danny. I just got lost for a while. But I'm here now, and I'm not making that mistake again. What do you need? Tell me what you need." Daniel started to protest, to say he didn't need anything, that just seeing Marcus again was enough. But Marcus insisted. He said, "I mean it. You spent our entire childhood believing in me. You told me I'd change the world. Well, I built something, and I did it on the foundation of confidence you gave me. So tell me how I can help." Daniel was quiet for a long time, and then he said honestly, "I'd just like to not worry about rent every month. I'd like to be able to take my daughter to dinner without calculating every dollar. I'd like to feel secure. That's it. Just security." What Marcus did next wasn't flashy or public at first. He set up a trust fund that would provide Daniel with a steady income for the rest of his life, enough that he'd never have to worry about money again. He also bought the building where Daniel's studio apartment was and made sure Daniel owned his unit outright. No rent, no mortgage, just his. But Marcus didn't stop there. He asked Daniel what he'd do if money wasn't an issue. What dream had he given up on? Daniel admitted he'd always wanted to open a community center in underserved neighborhoods like the one they grew up in, a place where kids could go after school for tutoring, meals, mentorship, safety. Marcus made that dream a reality. He funded the Daniel Carter Community Center, which opened 18 months later in Detroit, in the same neighborhood where they'd grown up. Daniel ran it, and it became a lifeline for hundreds of kids who needed exactly what Daniel and Marcus had needed at that age, someone to believe in them. The story didn't end there. Marcus brought Daniel into his company, not as charity, but as a consultant on corporate social responsibility initiatives. Daniel's lived experience and perspective became invaluable in shaping programs that actually help people rather than just looking good on paper. They rebuilt their friendship, talking weekly, visiting each other, making up for lost time. And Marcus started a foundation focused on supporting people who had fallen through economic cracks. People like Daniel who had worked hard their whole lives, but had been crushed by circumstances beyond their control. In interviews about the foundation, Marcus always credited Daniel. He'd say, "My best friend reminded me that success means nothing if you're not using it to lift others up. He showed me what real wealth looks like, and it's not in a bank account. That here's why this story matters." We live in a world that celebrates individual achievement, that tells us success is about climbing higher and accumulating more. But real success, the kind that actually means something, is about connection and loyalty and remembering the people who shaped you. Marcus could have walked out of that cafe. He could have given Daniel $100 and a business card and gone back to his billionaire life feeling like he'd done his good deed. But instead, he chose to restore a friendship and honor a debt that was never actually owed but was deeply felt. He chose to recognize that his success wasn't just his, that it was built on encouragement and belief that Daniel had given him when they were kids with nothing. There's a psychological concept called survivorship bias, where we focus on the people who made it and ignore all the people who didn't, assuming the difference is talent or hard work. But luck and circumstance and privilege play enormous roles in who succeeds and who struggles. Marcus had opportunities Daniel didn't. He got that scholarship. He was in the right place at the right time for the tech boom. His life could have easily gone the other way. And Daniel's life could have gone differently if one factory hadn't closed or one marriage hadn't ended. They were equally smart, equally hardworking. But their outcomes were radically different until Marcus made a choice to use his resources to change that. If this story moved you, here's what I need you to do. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that friendship matters, that loyalty matters, that using success to help others is the only way success actually means anything. Comment below and tell me about a friendship that shaped your life or a time someone showed up for you when you needed it most. And subscribe because I'm bringing you stories that don't just entertain but challenge how you think about wealth, success, and what it means to be a good human. Marcus and Daniel's story is a reminder that the people who believe in us when we have nothing deserve to be remembered when we have everything. It's a reminder that it's never too late to reconnect, to make things right, to honor the bonds that formed us. And it's a reminder that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the people we choose to bring with us as we rise. Thanks for watching.